During my husband's memorial service, the woman he'd been secretly involved with stood up mid-ceremony, faced the crowd, and declared he was never hers, he was always mine. Her voice sliced through the chapel with a confidence that didn't belong to her, like she believed this moment was hers to claim. Her words hovered, sharp and intrusive, like a slap I wasn't granted permission to return. The room froze. Heads turned toward me, some full of pity, others stunned, a few seemingly waiting for my reaction. But I remained motionless. I said nothing. I only watched the woman who had at some point captured my husband's affections, or whatever fraction he still had left to give. My daughter's hand stayed wrapped in mine. Beside me, my aunt's fingers clenched more tightly around my upper arm. Every muscle in my body wanted to erupt, but I stayed composed because I knew something she didn't. This story wasn't finished yet. Just moments later, our longtime attorney, Meredith Quinn, rose from the back pew and made her way to the front of the room. She carried a rectangular wooden box, both hands steady beneath it. All eyes followed her, uncertain whether this was part of the memorial or some unscripted turn of events. She faced the mistress directly, then said with quiet finality, "He instructed this to be given to you." The woman accepted the box as though she'd won a prize, smiling faintly, smug in the spotlight. She unlatched the lid and let out a scream that tore through the stillness. So if this story moved something in you, if it made you pause or see your own reflection between the lines, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are more truths coming, and maybe, just maybe, one of them will help someone else find their way out of the quiet too. Now, let's go back to the moment she opened the box. Before the funeral, I didn't cry. I couldn't. Not for my husband, Liam. Not yet. He had been gone for 6 days, taken suddenly by a ruptured aneurysm in the middle of a business flight from Chicago. They told me it was painless, that he would have felt nothing at all, but I didn't cling to those details. What haunted me wasn't how quietly he left this world, but the quiet he left behind. A silence so thick it felt like dust, settling into the corners of our lives. I remember the morning of the funeral in fragments, like pieces of a film reel someone had half burned. The bitter smell of dark roast coffee I brewed out of habit, but couldn't bring myself to sip. The soft clinking of Aunt Vivian's pearl bracelet as she kept readjusting it, again and again, like something about its rhythm might hold her upright. And Nina, my daughter, just 8, bundled in a coat that seemed too stiff for her small body, zipping it with trembling fingers, trying to act grown-up. As if this were just another adult event, with long silences and unfamiliar shoes, not the day her father was laid to rest. "You look beautiful," Aunt Vivian murmured, as she pinned a tiny white rose to my coat. A widow's flower, she called it. I didn't answer. I barely looked up. The mirror offered me someone unrecognizable, too pale, too polished, like grief had been scrubbed clean from my face. My hair was pinned back too tightly. Concealer masked the bruises fatigue had left beneath my eyes. I'd worn the same soft coral lipstick I wore on our engagement anniversary, chosen then with joy, and now with something closer to vengeance. It no longer felt romantic. It felt like armor. The ride to the church was soundless. I sat between Aunt Vivian and Nina in the back of her dented gray sedan, the heater rattling weakly through the vents. Nina held my hand the whole way, squeezing it tighter every time we passed an intersection. She hadn't asked about the collapse, or the hospital, or the moment they'd called me at 2:17 a.m. She just kept whispering one question when the house was quiet enough. Did Daddy love me? That question unraveled me in ways no obituary ever could. When we pulled up, I was startled by the crowd. I hadn't expected so many people. The chapel steps overflowed with solemn guests. Umbrellas gathered like black petals under a wet sky. Some came with casseroles. Others brought polite condolences and sad eyes. And still, a few arrived armed with gossip, with glances that lingered too long. We took our seats near the front, beside 2 large arrangements of white lilies and wild roses. I had picked them myself. Liam hated the smell, said they reminded him of old waiting rooms. I chose them anyway. The funeral might have been his, but the grief was mine. My farewell, even if I wasn't sure who I was saying goodbye to, the man I married, or the stranger I'd slept beside for the last year. As the first chords of the organ settled into the air, I scanned the pews, faces from every corner of our life. K-workers, cousins, neighbors. A few of Liam's old soccer buddies from university. Then, I saw her. She stood near the back, right beneath the stained glass arch, as if debating whether to come inside. Tall, impeccably styled, draped in a crimson wrap dress that shimmered softly under the sanctuary lights. Celeste Munro. She didn't need a name tag. I'd seen hers enough, on gift receipts, expense statements, a handwritten note tucked inside his briefcase when he thought I wasn't looking. I leaned toward Aunt Vivian and whispered, "She's here." She didn't ask who. She only tightened her jaw and slid her hand into mine. Celeste walked the aisle like she owned a piece of the story. Her heels clicked with each step, confident, choreographed. Her gaze found mine briefly, and there was no guilt in it. Just possession, like she'd come to claim what was hers. Nina shifted beside me, confused by the sudden tension in my body. I smoothed her hair, kissed her temple, and whispered, "Just listen to what people say about Daddy, sweetheart." She nodded slowly, too young to see through grown-up lies. When the pastor began to speak, I let my eyes drift to the photograph on the casket. I had chosen it myself. Liam, laughing with Nina at a lakeside cabin, the kind of candid that looks unposed but is always slightly practiced. I remembered taking that photo. He was wearing his favorite flannel, tossing pine cones in the water. It looked genuine. Maybe it even was. For that second, I stared at it, willing myself to feel something clean, something simple, but all I could sense was betrayal, stretching underneath the sorrow like rot beneath fresh paint. And as Celeste settled herself a few pews behind me, legs crossed at the ankle, one manicured hand flicking her glossy hair over her shoulder like a curtain before a grand entrance, I felt something settle in my chest. Not grief, not even fury. It was clarity. This day wasn't going to be about closure. It wasn't about reverence or farewells. It was going to be about the raw truth, about what had been hidden in shadows too long. And maybe, just maybe, if fate was feeling generous, it would also be the day I got my freedom back. The pastor was mid-sentence, reading softly from the Psalms, when Celeste Munro, cloaked in crimson as if she'd come to toast a victory, rose from her seat. She moved with the kind of grace that only comes when someone believes they are untouchable. She stepped into the aisle with deliberate confidence, her heels clicking once sharp, certain against the wooden floor. The sound rang out like a spark in a powder keg. Heads turned. A few people whispered her name. Some recognized her from company parties or charity events where she hovered near Liam's side, always introduced as a consultant or client. Others didn't know her at all, but the tension that swept through the room told everyone something unnatural was about to unfold. The kind of silence that holds its breath. The pastor faltered, confused. His eyes darted toward me as if silently asking, "Is this part of the program?" I gave him nothing, not a nod, not a glance. This wasn't mine to interrupt. Celeste didn't wait for permission. She turned to face the congregation, lifted her chin with the calmness of a woman about to deliver a prepared statement, and projected her voice so everyone, every last stunned mourner, could hear it. "I know most of you don't know me," she began, her tone syrupy sweet with just a hint of triumph. "But I knew Liam in ways many of you never could. Not just who he was, but who he really was, beneath the masks and the husband routine." Gasps fluttered like a breeze across the sanctuary. Aunt Vivian stiffened beside me and leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper. "We should put a stop to this." But I shook my head. "Let her finish," I said quietly. I needed to hear the version of the story she'd convinced herself was true. I needed to know just how far she would go to rewrite him. Celeste placed her hand over her heart, like she was performing grief, rather than feeling it. I was part of Liam's life for nearly 5 years. 5. And it wasn't a secret. He told me everything about the pressure, the distance, the loneliness, how trapped he felt in a life he never wanted, how he couldn't be himself in that house of obligations and expectations. People squirmed in their seats. Some dropped their gazes, others cast uncomfortable glances my way. Celeste's voice cracked slightly, but not with sorrow, with drama. She knew how to play the room. "He told me he only stayed because of his daughter," she added, looking directly at me. "Not because he loved her." That looked cold, satisfied, smug. There was no apology in her eyes, no shame, just the certainty of someone who believed they'd won, that Liam had left all the property to her, that this spectacle was hers to control. I didn't blink, but my insides roared. Nina tugged gently at my sleeve. "Mommy, why is that lady saying those things?" she whispered. I squeezed her hand, steady. "Ignore her, baby," I murmured. The room had gone dead still, the kind of silence that waits to see if something sacred is about to be broken. The pastor took a tentative step forward, his voice cautious. "Ma'am, this really isn't the time." But before he could finish the sentence, another voice rose from the far left aisle. Calm, crisp, unbothered.
Ms. Monroe.
Heads turned once more, this time toward Meredith Quinn, our family attorney, who had stood quietly from the last row. She walked with the slow purpose of someone used to courtrooms and drama, her hands cradling a small wooden box, dark cherry, unadorned, but heavy in a way that demanded attention. Celeste stopped mid-breath. Her posture faltered for the first time all morning. Her smug expression gave way to something more guarded. Meredith reached the front and turned toward her, not unkind, but firm. "Liam left behind very specific instructions," she said with the kind of authority that silences rooms. "He requested that this be delivered to you. Today, in public." Celeste blinked. She looked uncertain for the first time since she'd swept into that chapel. But still, she reached for the box slowly, like someone accepting a long-awaited prize. Her fingers traced the edges of the lid with a kind of reverence, nails painted in a deep wine red that matched the silk of her dress. The shade shimmered beneath the soft light from the stained glass windows, as if she'd dressed not for mourning, but for a coronation. The sanctuary had fallen utterly silent again. But this time, it wasn't grief that held everyone still. It was anticipation, a thick, suspended tension that curled around each person like mist. People leaned forward in their seats without realizing. Aunt Vivian sat frozen beside me, lips pressed tight. Nina barely blinked. Even the pastor stepped subtly back, giving the moment over to whatever was about to unfold. Celeste cast one last glance at me, one that carried all the smugness of someone convinced she'd won. Then she lifted the lid. I don't know what she expected. A love letter, perhaps. A set of keys. Maybe even a ring. Some final token of affection to prove that Liam had saved something tender just for her. But what she found inside was something entirely different. Her eyes landed on the contents, and her expression faltered. Her lips parted slightly, a breath catching in her throat, but no words came. Then, without warning, she slammed the lid shut with a force that echoed across the pews and let out a scream, piercing, raw, almost primal. It wasn't just surprise, it was devastation. Rage, betrayal, shame, boiling all at once in a sound that tore through the room. She stumbled backward, as if the box had scorched her palms. It hit the floor with a dull thud, bouncing once on the carpet before coming to rest at the foot of the pulpit. Celeste turned and fled down the aisle, heels unsteady, composure in ruins. Gasps followed her like a tide. The chapel doors slammed behind her, loud enough to rattle the window panes. And then, silence. The box remained where it fell, untouched. Meredith Quinn looked over at me and gave the faintest nod, a signal we'd agreed on the night before. I didn't look at the box. I didn't have to. I already knew what was inside. Liam had orchestrated this, his final performance. He had betrayed me in life, yes, but in death he'd chosen to leave behind something harder than guilt. Truth, the kind you couldn't shout over or twist with clever words. The kind you had to face in a room full of strangers when the illusion you clung to fell apart. The night before the service, I had sat at my kitchen table across from Meredith. The house was hushed, the fridge humming in the background, the clock ticking with every second I refused to sleep. Nina had gone to bed hours earlier, clutching a stuffed rabbit she hadn't touched in years. Aunt Vivian was in the guest room, whispering a prayer into the dark. Meredith unfolded Liam's will and slid it toward me. I didn't reach for it. "There's something unusual," she said gently. "A clause Liam added not long before the trip. He left a box for someone named Celeste Monroe." I laughed before I meant to, not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. Of course he did. Yes, I said. I know exactly who she is. Meredith watched me carefully. I could tell she wanted to ask if I was okay. I wasn't, but I'd stopped expecting to be okay for a long time. What's in it? I asked. She hesitated. A photo. And a note. Handwritten. He requested it be given to her publicly. He was insistent on that point. I stared at the knots in the grain of our dining table, the surface we'd once shared late dinners on. Birthday cake, Nina's school projects. Now it held the final echo of Liam's deceit. He really wanted her to see it, in front of everyone? Meredith nodded. His words were, I want her to hear the truth in a place where she can't deny it. Part of me felt nauseous, but another part, a part I had buried beneath years of silence and self-doubt, felt something dangerously close to justice. I looked at her and said, then do it. She blinked. You're sure? No, I said, but do it anyway. I had spent years swallowing my voice, bending to keep the image intact, staying silent for the sake of appearances. For Nina, but silence only preserves the lie, never the peace. I wasn't going to carry that anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beneath the ceiling fan, blinking at the shadows, replaying every moment I'd begged myself to be enough for him, every dinner I'd waded through, every lie I'd tried to believe. I had blamed myself for his distance, wondered what I lacked that sent him into someone else's arms. But the absence wasn't in me. It had always been in him. It was in the way he used charm like currency, and how he weaponized my loyalty like it was something he could wrap around my throat. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I wouldn't stop her. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't plead. I would let Celeste Munro march into that chapel with her perfect dress and perfectly rehearsed delusions, and declare herself the chosen one. Let her tell the story she needed to believe. Because I already knew what was in the box. Liam's final words weren't tender. They weren't an apology. They were a scalpel. Precise. Brutal. Honest. Meredith had shown it to me the night before. The note, the photograph, the line Liam had scribbled in his own sharp handwriting. His final confession, or maybe just his final cruelty. I'd only read it once, and that was all I needed. To Celeste Munro, for the years I stole from both my wife and my daughter. I need you to know this. I never loved you. You were never more than a distraction, a reckless indulgence I used to escape the weight of my own failures. You were not my future, only the illusion of freedom I clung to when I couldn't face what I was ruining. Whatever words I told you, whatever promises I made, they were never meant to last. I used you for the thrill, for the chase, for the lie that I could still be someone other than who I had become. You meant nothing real. Every cent I earned, every asset I acquired, from the lake house in Vermont, the investment accounts, the publishing rights, to the trust I set aside, all of it now belongs to my daughter, Nina. She is the only legacy I have left that matters. Do not contact my family again. Liam W. Calder. That was it. No apology, no regret, no explanation that tried to dress the betrayal in softer clothes. Perhaps that was the truest thing he'd ever given me. A sentence that stripped away the illusion Celeste had convinced herself was love, and left her with nothing but the truth. He hadn't left me a letter, not a single word. Maybe that was his final insult. Or maybe it was his silent admission that words would never be enough to cover the wreckage. I didn't care either way. I had already stopped needing anything from him. I gave Meredith the nod that night across my kitchen table, the air still smelling faintly of lemon oil and the roast I couldn't bring myself to eat. Let her open it, I said quietly. Let the truth speak louder than I ever could. Because sometimes, silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the sharpest edge in the drawer. And sometimes, letting someone destroy their own fantasy is far more satisfying than tearing it apart yourself. The moment Celeste's fingers touched the lid, the air in the church shifted. It wasn't just stillness, it was expectation. A hushed current ran through the pews like everyone somehow knew they were about to witness something sacred or brutal, or both. I could feel the eyes. On her, on me, on the box. Nina sat pressed close against my side, silent and alert. Aunt Vivian hadn't moved since Meredith stepped forward. Even the pastor, who had fumbled through his binder earlier, now stood back, hands folded, watching it unfold like it was no longer his ceremony to guide. Celeste stood at the altar, framed by white lilies, and the smiling portrait of Liam, the picture I'd chosen carefully, the one that made people forget how complicated he'd become. She held the wooden box like it contained his soul. Maybe she thought there'd be an engagement ring inside, a letter confessing eternal love. Maybe she thought he had truly left me, even in death. But Liam never did anything clean. His truths were always entangled in ego and impulse, and his lies wore cologne. She opened it slowly, trying to savor the drama. I watched her eyes scan the contents. No gasp, no tears, just a prolonged silence, as if her mind needed extra time to decode what she was seeing. Then her composure cracked. Her lips parted, a tremble began in her jaw. She lifted the single photograph, a candid of her and Liam, arms wrapped around each other on what looked like a beach in Mexico. I'd never seen it before, but I knew she had framed it in her mind as proof, a symbol, maybe even a promise. Then she turned it over. That was when it came. The sound. Not a gasp, not a sob, a scream, raw and wounded. The kind of scream you only hear when something you believed with all your heart dies in an instant. She dropped the photo like it burned her, stumbled backward. Her heels wobbled. The box hit the ground with a hollow clatter, its lid swinging open, revealing the message for all the world to see. I didn't need to stand. I didn't need to speak. The truth was doing just fine on its own. Her face was flushed, panic blooming across her skin like a rash. She looked around, searching for someone, anyone, to rescue her from the collapse of the life she had built in secret. But no one moved. The woman in the second row stood, half whispering, "What is happening?" Celeste turned to the room like a spotlight had betrayed her. "He lied to me," she cried. "He said he was leaving her. He said I was the only one." Her voice cracked like old glass. The congregation buzzed with hushed disbelief. Murmurs filled the air like a storm gathering weight. Some people exchanged looks. Others whispered in their palms. Grief had taken a back seat. The drama now belonged to betrayal. Celeste clutched her chest heaving, mascara streaking along her cheekbones. But she wasn't just heartbroken. She was undone, naked in front of strangers, her identity unraveling like the hem of a cheap dress. Then she turned toward me. Step by step, she closed the space between us, her eyes wild, red-rimmed, fixed on mine. I stood slowly, placing Nina behind me and resting a steady hand on the pew. I didn't brace for confrontation. I braced for the question I knew she'd ask.
Why?
She whispered. Her voice cracked like something delicate dropped on tile. Why would he do that to me? I looked at her for a long moment. I wanted to feel pity, but all I found was fatigue. Then I said plain and quiet, "Because he did it to me first." And I sat back down. She stood there, blinking, stunned. Her arms fell to her sides like she'd run out of strength. And then she turned, her walk no longer graceful but uneven and dazed. Her heels clicked like broken metronomes against the floor as she pushed open the chapel doors and disappeared into the daylight. The silence she left behind was dense. Some guests stared at the doors, some at the box, a few at me. But I gave them nothing. No gloating, no tears, no whispered satisfaction. I didn't need to. The truth had done its work. Liam never spoke a word that day, but his final message, cold and unmistakable, rang louder than any sermon. He left her with nothing but the truth, and in doing so, he finally gave me the only thing he never managed in life, clarity. After the final hymn faded, I didn't go to the reception. I let the guests file out with awkward hugs and half-hearted condolences. Some avoided my eyes. Some smiled as if pretending they hadn't just watched a woman shatter in public. One woman muttered that grief makes people act strangely, like denial could rewrite what they'd seen. Let them talk. I gathered my purse, took Nina's hand, and walked her out to the car. She was quiet, holding the little wooden cross the funeral home had passed out at the door. It dangled from her fingers like she wasn't quite sure what it meant. She didn't ask about Celeste. She didn't need to. But when she looked up at me, her eyes were full of something I hadn't seen in a while. When we got inside, Nina finally broke the silence. She'd been quiet the entire ride home, her little fingers still wrapped around the wooden cross from the funeral service, the one she refused to let go of, even when her seatbelt dug into her coat. "Mom," she asked softly, eyes watching me through the rearview mirror, "who was that lady in the red dress?" I didn't lie. I couldn't. Not to her. "She was someone your dad knew," I said, keeping my voice even. "Someone who thought she meant more to him than she really did." She looked out the window for a while after that, her breath fogging up the glass, then asked in a voice even quieter than before, "Did she hurt you?" I paused, because how do you explain betrayal to an 8-year-old without making her feel like she came from something broken? "No," I said finally, steadying my voice. "She didn't hurt me. He did. But I'm not going to carry that forever. And neither are you." She gave a small nod, one of those almost imperceptible gestures that made her look older than she was. Then she leaned into me as we parked the car, resting her head against my side as we walked up to the front door. That simple act, her weight, her trust, felt heavier and more healing than anything anyone had said to me all week. That night, the house didn't feel haunted. It wasn't quiet because it was empty. It was quiet because it was ours again. For the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't oppressive. It was space, breathable, mine. I walked into the bedroom, no, my bedroom now, and stood in the doorway for a long while. The bed looked different. Smaller somehow. The nightstand, still cluttered with his unread paperbacks and half-dead charger cords, felt like an echo instead of a presence. I opened the second drawer on the left, the one where I had once found the receipts, the ones that had started the slow unraveling of everything. It didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. Just a room. I went to the closet and took out his last suit. The one he'd worn to our anniversary dinner the year before. Charcoal gray. Slightly wrinkled at the collar. I ran my hand along the lapel, trying unsuccessfully to remember what it had felt like to love him without suspicion. Without dissecting every "I'm working late," every locked phone screen, every smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That version of him had existed, I suppose. Once. But loving someone isn't the same as knowing them. And as painful as it was to admit, I never really knew Liam, not fully. Not honestly. Not until it was too late. I folded the suit carefully, laid it inside a box labeled donation, and sealed the lid. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need anything that belonged to the version of my life that I had to keep pretending was whole. The next morning I made pancakes. Real ones, with chocolate chips and cinnamon. I turned on the old kitchen speaker, played Nina's favorite song, and for the first time in what felt like years, she laughed. Loud and real. A sound so full of light that I had to blink back the burn behind my eyes. And that was when it hit me. I wasn't mourning Liam anymore. I was mourning me, the version of myself who believed that love had to be earned, that loyalty meant silence, that being strong meant enduring pain without ever letting it show.
But that version of me, she was gone, buried somewhere between the silence I kept and the truth I finally let speak.
I wasn't angry at Celeste anymore. Not really. I think she loved him in her own way. Or maybe she just loved being chosen. I used to know what that felt like. To be picked. To be seen. But love built on secrets and stolen moments isn't love. It's survival. And I'm done surviving. I want to live. Liam thought the truth would destroy her. And maybe, in a way, it did. But it freed me. And in the strangest, most twisted way, maybe that was his final gift to me. People always say funerals are for the living. I used to think that meant closure. The folding of a chapter. The soft sigh of something ending. But now I think it means choice. You get to choose who you'll become when the worst parts of your story are behind you. You get to decide whether the pain shapes you into something smaller or something stronger. I chose the latter. That morning, as I stood by the window, coffee in hand, hair still damp from the shower, I watched Nina chase our dog across the backyard, barefoot in dew-soaked grass, her laughter rising like sunlight. And I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies, not for answers, not for someone to rescue me from my grief. I had already done it. I had saved myself.